Welcome to our second plenary of the 8th Annual Generative Anthropology Summer Conference. How's the volume at the back? Can you hear okay? Perfect. Okay. For those of you who are coming to our conference for the first time, my name is Richard Van Oort. I'm a member of the English department at UVic, and UVic is the English department at UVic is one of the sponsors of this conference, along with the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, the Generative Anthropology Society Conference, and Quantum Polytechnic University. And so I'd just like to take a moment to thank our sponsors. And in particular, I'd like to thank Quantum Polytechnic University because their portion of the funding was earmarked particularly towards bringing Raymond Tallis over from England to Canada, and specifically to Victoria for the first time, I believe, to give this talk. So I'd just like to acknowledge that vital support. And I have to say, after 2 full days of the conference, I'm tremendously pleased with having brought Ray over here, because he's a tremendous interlocutor, as I hope you'll all discover in the course of his lecture. Let me just say a few words of introduction about Raymond Tallis. I'm sure his work is familiar to very many of you, but I'd just like to stress how privileged we are to have him with us today. Tallis's CV reminds me of one of those 19th century novels. It's so massive it has to be divided into volumes. But what is even more astounding than the extraordinary length of his accomplishments is the breadth. The man clearly has no respect for academic boundaries. A trained medical doctor, Tallis was professor of geriatric medicine from 1980 to 2006 at the University of Manchester. Over the course of his medical career, he authored about 200 medical publications, mostly in the field of the neurology of old age. Furthermore, he was project director for neurosciences in the Greater Manchester area, and that was between 1997 and 2001. And during this time, he oversaw the development of an integrated neurosciences center for over 3 million people. By all accounts, Raymond Tallis is an extremely energetic, distinguished, and prolific medical researcher. But here's the kicker. While he's been spearheading developments in the medical sciences, he has been acting, seemingly with his left hand and effortlessly, as an outspoken defender of the humanities. He's been doing our job for us. Over the last 20 years, he has published fiction, 3 volumes of poetry, and 23 books on the philosophy of mind, philosophical anthropology, literary theory, and the nature of art and cultural criticism. I mean, most of us would envy having that on our CVs, let alone all the medical stuff. Now, the editor of Prospect magazine, David Goodhart, describes Tallis as, and I quote, probably unique in British intellectual culture in being able to contribute not only in his own technical specialism, but also to write with authority and elegance about everything from evolutionary psychology to Heidegger. End quote. In 2009, The Economist's Intelligent Life magazine listed Tallis as one of the top living polymaths in the world. In 2007, he was nominated as one of the 50 brains of Britain by The Independent. His 2011 book, Aping Mankind, was named one of the books of the year by The Guardian, that was by David Lodge, by The Observer, and by The Evening Standard. And as I have very pleasantly discovered over the course of the past few days, Ray has a really excellent sense of humor. In his lecture today, Raymond Tallis will be arguing against the widely held view that we are best defined by our biology. Please welcome me and join him. Please join me in welcoming Professor Raymond Tallis.
Richard, thank you for that lovely introduction. After that introduction, the best thing to happen now would be I'd drop dead, because I can't possibly fulfill the expectations that have been raised by that very gracious introduction. Thank you to Richard, thank you to Andrew Bartlett and to the team for inviting me to participate in this Generative Anthropology Society conference. And I'm grateful to you for several reasons. First of all, you've taken an interest in some of the ideas I put out over the last 2 or 3 decades, ideas which have been largely neglected, I would say, in academia, and also somehow haven't figured as far as I would hope in the big conversation we in society should be having about our own nature. But also giving me the opportunity to learn from you about your ideas, and in particular making me acquainted with the work of Eric Gans. And I had a 9-hour flight across from Frankfurt to Vancouver, and when we got on board the plane, everybody closed the windows, so we were suddenly pitched into a sort of illuminated tunnel for 9 hours. I was utterly absorbed. It was perfect. I was in a burqa of total attention and concentration because I was reading Eric's new ways of thinking. And that's the first time I'd seriously engaged with his work. And it has certainly been, it's opened a few dormer windows in my consciousness. So thank you for that. Thank you also, and I speak now from the heart as someone who's been on the circuit, for basically taking such care of me and making it such fun. I don't have any secretary anymore, I've retired, and these characters sorted everything out, and I can tell you I've had different experiences from many other meetings I've been to. So thank you very much indeed. I had anticipated that I would leave Canada with some of my ideas changed and a few of my prejudices unconfirmed, and I think it's going to happen. So one of the things we're going to do, and I'll come to this in a second, is after my talk have a dialogue with Eric, which I feel is a great privilege. Well, behind my talk is a preoccupation that has exercised me for a very long time. It's to arrive at an understanding of ourselves that avoids 2, to me, equally undesirable modes of thought: a supernatural or broadly a religious account of what we are and how we came about, and a naturalistic one that sees us as entirely parts of nature, more specifically as very clever chimps. A proper understanding of ourselves must acknowledge that we are irreducible persons who are on the one hand not mere organisms, nor on the other good or bad angels. We are, as Maurice Merleau-Ponty said, embodied subjects. We are agents. We are to some extent independent points of departure. Though this doesn't mean that we should embrace a dualism that sees us as ghosts that have somehow got caught up in biological machinery. Now, I could have talked about any of 3 things: emphasizing that we're fundamentally different from other organisms, including chimpanzees, our nearest primate kin; looking at what ways we're different from other organisms, including chimpanzees. And I'm going to talk about those 2 things in my talk. But we could equally have discussed how we got to be so different, and that is the theme for another talk. But it's also, I think, going to figure in the conversation that Eric and I have after this talk. Anybody who wants to explain how we got to be so different, and also to be true to Darwinian thought, has to provide some kind of biological account of how we, in part, escaped from a purely biological destiny, how we came to live lives so distant from nature. And in fact, if anybody would like a copy of the paper which I sent to Richard or Andrew, I've forgotten who, called The Sighted Watchmaker, How We Came to Be So Different, I'm sure I'd be happy to distribute it. But that's not the talk for today, although it is something I spent a lot of time writing about. Those of you who are masochists may wish to read this 1,000-page trilogy in which, in pitiless detail, I set out the means by which we became such exceptional primates to the point that it doesn't make sense to call us primates. Now, I'm a humanist, and this requires not only that one rejects the doctrines of the 200 or so religions that are on offer, though not for a moment denying their huge cultural importance and their contribution for good as well as ill to making us what we are, but also, for me, the materialist atheism that would deny our human uniqueness and willfully overlook the fact that we are utterly different from anything else in the known universe, not the least because we are that in virtue of which the universe comes to some extent to be known. And although this theme is one that's been exercising me over the last 30 years, it's only fairly recently I put my thoughts on this this theme in a single place, namely the volume that has already been referred to, namely Aping Mankind, Neuromania, Darwinitis, and the Misrepresentation of Humanity by Summa contra Biologism. The latter is not very good there. Which, of course, by no coincidence, has the same title as this talk. Now, much of the book, and indeed much of what I say in this talk, is negative, criticising widely held beliefs that I think are profoundly wrong. But I don't apologise for this. The job to be done in the coming decades in developing a clearer idea of what we humans are, what image we can form of ourselves in the wake of the, to me, welcome decline of religious belief, central to the intellectual and imaginative challenge of humanism, will be all the harder if we're already stuck in thinking about ourselves in the wrong way. So it's trying to persuade you not to think about ourselves in this way that will be the burden of my talk. Now, my master theme is biologism. No problem with biology, it's biologism. The assumption that we humans are essentially animal organisms and are best understood through the biological sciences. This is an idea of some antiquity, of course, but it currently has unprecedented currency in academia, in the profitable letters, and indeed in the popular press. Biologism is founded on two pillars of unwisdom, Neuromania and Darwinitis, and I want to offer you a brief characterization of each. Neuromania is based on the assumption that human consciousness is identical with neural activity in the human brain. Thus, I am my brain and you are your brain. The brain explains every aspect of human awareness and behavior and so on. And from this it follows if you want to understand human beings, you must peer into the darkness inside their skulls using neuroscientific techniques for recording brain activity. Now, the neuromaniac's favorite toy is a tool which has made huge contributions to real neuroscience, functional magnetic resonance imaging, which enables you to see neural activity in the living waking brain. And you can see an example of an fMRI image, which, as Matt Crawford has said, has become the fast-acting solvent of the critical sense. It is almost impossible to open a newspaper without an example of a brain scan next to an article breathless with excitement reporting that scientists have found the secret of love, of wisdom, or of our sense of beauty. You just expose your chosen subjects to the relevant stimuli and see which bits of their brains light up. So much for neuromania. What about Darwinitis? This is an inflamed or pathological version of Darwinism. It asserts that evolutionary theory explains not only how the organism Homo sapiens arose, but also the nature of people like you and me. Evolutionary forces, natural selection, survival advantage, blah blah, explain the origin and purpose of human behavior and human institutions. Everything is forged in and distantly or otherwise relates to the bloodbath in which genes are shaped by the differential survival of organisms. It's rarely expressed as crudely as that, but this is the ultimate implication. The processes that produce millipedes were the same as those that produced Mozart. In brief, Darwinitis is the assumption that Darwinism encompasses not only the biological roots of the human organism, which of course it does, but the cultural leaves of the human person, which it doesn't. Now, you may think all of this sounds pretty harmless stuff, or better than harmless, perhaps a frank acknowledgement of what we are. But let's look at the implications of biologism as they are drawn by a writer, one of the few, who acknowledges them fully. Consider the consequences of neuromania as drawn out by the eminent neuroscientist Colin Blakemore in his excellent Reith lectures many years ago, The Mechanics of Mind. The human brain, he said, is a machine which alone accounts for all our actions, our most private thoughts, our beliefs. All our actions are products of the activity of our brains. It makes no sense, in scientific terms, to try to distinguish sharply between acts that result from conscious attention and those that result from our reflexes, or are caused by disease or damage to the brain. This, of course, has huge implications for our freedom. If we're identical with our brains, or certain neural discharges in them, we must be just as unfree when we are conscious as when we are unconscious, when we're walking down the stairs or when we're falling down the stairs. Now, many have drawn this conclusion and asserted that free will is an illusion, or even more contentiously, that neuroscientists have shown that free will is an illusion. Now, it would follow from this, if it were true, that we'd be in the grip of biological forces, which boil down to physical forces. We couldn't be aware of the reasons for our actions. In fact, our reasons would be irrelevant because causes would dominate. We wouldn't be agents at all. Indeed, the reasons for our actions would simply be effects that are mere effects of anterior causes. We would be absorbed into nature. Natural parts of a natural world, which, given that living matter is ultimately regulated by the laws of matter, period, we would be material parts of the material world, entirely wired into the forces of physical nature. Now, it's this that makes it rather extraordinary that so many in the humanities, which one might expect will be a bulwark against scientism and biologism, should have embraced neuroscience and evolutionary theory as a guide to their own disciplines, with such enthusiasm. Collaboration rather than resistance seems to be the watchword. They have listened to the words of the once despised prophet E.O. Wilson, who argued that the humanities, ranging from philosophy and history to moral reasoning, comparative religion, and interpretation of the arts, will draw closer to the sciences and partly fuse with them on science's terms. For example, there is a flourishing pseudo-discipline of neuroaesthetics, which purports to explain both creativity and intellectual pleasure in terms of activity in certain parts of the brain. Brain tingles is all. This propensity for brain tingles has been implanted us, we're told, by evolution, hence Darwinian aesthetics, which makes sure we tingle to the right kinds of things. For example, symmetrical faces, or pictures of landscapes loaded with food. Neurolaw aims to replace the untidy processes of the legal system with a biological justice rooted in an understanding of the neural causes of criminal action. Neuroeconomics can explain why we buy things we don't need, or we shouldn't buy, by looking at the balance between the want-it center in the amygdaloid body and the wait until you can afford it center in the frontal lobe. Those toxic subprime mortgages that led to the financial meltdown of 2007 and 2008 were in fact neurotoxic. Conspicuous consumption and our trillion-pound debts are driven by our instinct to advertise our genetic health. Neuropoliticians tell us we should look beyond the ideologies of the right and left to understanding the rivalry between the right and the left hemisphere of the brain. Neurotheologians look for God spots in the brain where religious experiences and beliefs are located. The evolutionary theorists of religion tell us that the God spot has been implanted in our brains because religion, believe it or not, promotes solidarity and inclusive fitness. Ethics is also rooted in the replicative imperative of the selfish gene. Even altruism, which may seem to be a puzzle for the dog-eat-dog world of Darwinism, can be explained, we're told, in evolutionary terms by employing the notion of inclusive fitness. This is the sum of an organism's classical fitness, how many of its own offspring it produces and supports, and the number of equivalents of its own offspring it can add to the population by supporting or cooperating or simply being nice to others. Now, it wouldn't take long to expose the fallacies that are the foundation stories of all these pseudo-disciplines, but there isn't time in the present talk. It's all there in the book. The point for the present is that they are symptoms of a biologistic view of mankind, and this is what I want to focus on. By the way, the fact that biologism has undesirable consequences should not itself cut any ice. Just because you don't like something doesn't make it untrue. There's only an accidental connection between the palatable and the true. Unlike other people, I find it rather unpalatable to think I'm going to die one day. But this doesn't make my death untrue. Yuck, in short, is not an argument. So I need to focus on the fundamental errors of neuromania and Darwinitis. Let me start with neuromania. I'd like to look briefly at the logical errors behind neuromania, then talk about current limitations of the science that would make many claims premature, even if they were logically well-founded, which they're not, and finally talk about the fundamental barriers to neural explanations of consciousness that would remain even if the current limitations of neuroscience were overcome. And as a clinical neuroscientist, my research, I have to tell you I'm more aware probably of those limitations. And I remember a famous conversation between Tolstoy and Chekhov. Tolstoy was going on and on about peasant virtues, and Chekhov said, for God's sake, stuff it. I lived amongst peasants, I know what the buggers are like. And it just seems to me, when it comes to people tell me what neuroscience can and cannot do, and I think how long it took me to add my little grain of knowledge to the ant heap of wisdom, I realise there are huge limitations. Anyway, first of all, the conceptual muddle. Now, as a clinical neuroscientist for many years, I'm fully aware that to live a human life requires a brain in some kind of working order. Chop my head off, and my IQ goes down a few points. What I dispute is that it follows from this that living a human life is being a brain in a kind of working order. What neuroscience does is reveal some of the most important necessary conditions of behaviour and awareness. What it doesn't do is to provide a satisfactory account of the sufficient conditions of awareness and behaviour. The mistaken idea that it does is neuromania, which also draws on the assumption that rough correlations, and they're much rougher than you think, between observed neural activity and reported experience of behaviour, they imply that the neural activity causes the behaviour, or indeed causes consciousness, or even is identical with consciousness. And that is an error. To move from correlation to causation to identity is a mistake. So much for the logical error. Sorry about this. Just talk amongst yourselves a moment. Let me now move on to the empirical problems and illustrate them with two much discussed studies which seem to some to confirm that even our most complex feelings, emotions and activities are reducible to defined brain activity, and that even when we feel we're acting voluntarily, our brains are calling the shots. So I want to look at Semir Zeki and Andreas Bartell's study of the neurobiology of love, and secondly Benjamin Libet's studies of voluntary motor activity. First, Zeki and Andreas Bartell's claim that they have discovered the centre in the brain for romantic love, and they reported this in a paper published 10 years ago. The neural basis of romantic love. They've also published papers on the neural basis of love, brackets altruistic, and neural basis of some other kind of love, that classified love in different ways. How did they find what the neural basis of romantic love was? Well, what they did is they asked their subjects to look at a photograph of the face of someone with whom they were deeply in love, and then look at a photograph of three friends. This is when they had their head in the washing machine in the functional MRI scan, attached to their body. By subtracting the activity of the brain recorded when the subject looked at the pictures of their friends from that which was seen when they looked at their lovers, Zeki and Bartels, so they claim, were able to demonstrate the distinctive brain activity associated with love, brackets, romantic, unbrackets. Here it is, love, brackets, romantic. It's due to activity in a highly restricted area of the brain, in the medial insula and the anterior cingulate cortex, and subcortically in the caudate nucleus and the putamen, all bilaterally. Eat your heart out, stunt roll, Proust. And by the way, here it is in the picture I showed you earlier. That's what love is. Now this awakens wonder not that love could be tucked away in such a small space, but how could anyone fail to see the fallacies in the experimental design? These are many, and I would happily discuss some of them in the question and answers, but the most striking, of course, is the grotesque reduction of the state in question, namely love. And it's this I want to focus on. Love, ladies and gentlemen, is not like a response to a simple stimulus, such as a picture. Not even a single enduring state, like being a bit chilly. It is a many splendid and many misery thing. As anyone who's been in love, or read about it in a book, or even read about it in a crayoning book, will know that it includes many things. Here are a few. Feeling in love at that moment. Hunger for, simulated indifference to, delight over the beloved, wanting to be kind to him or her, wanting to impress the special hour, worrying over the logistics of meetings, lust, a bit of biology there of course, awe, surprise, joy, guilt, anger, jealousy, imagining conversations and events, speculating what the loved one's up to now, and so on and so forth. To construe it as a property of one organ, or a small part of one organ, or even of an organism, or of an organism responding to a stimulus, notwithstanding all its physiological components and the biological roots of some aspects of it, love belongs to a self, and that self relates to a very complex community of minds, of which more presently. In order to neuralize love in the way that Zeki and Bartels did, you have to reduce it to something like a response to something like a simple, repeatable stimulus. Doing this is deeply connected with the project of stuffing back into the intracranial darkness, into the standalone brain, something whose theatre is, of course, out there in the community of cells operating in a complex human world. You will be relieved to know that even the neuroscience community is starting to feel uneasy about the simplistic identification of activity in parts of the brain with human feelings and with propensities and behaviour. In a paper that was originally provocatively entitled Voodoo Correlations in Social Neuroscience, Ed Voll and Harold Pashler found flaws with the localizations observed in such studies. More recently, Catherine Button and colleagues in the prestigious Nature Neuroscience Reviews has mounted a savage critique of the statistics of the many studies that claim to demonstrate that particular aspects of our consciousness correlate closely with activity in certain regions of the brain. What she doesn't mention, and her colleagues, is there is always a propensity to publish papers that find positive correlations. If the study is then repeated and no positive correlation is found, then the study doesn't get published, and it certainly doesn't reach the front page of Time magazine. The process of simplification to prepare a piece of our humanity to be stuffed back into the brain is evident in my second example. A famous set of experiments carried out by the neurophysiologist Benjamin Libet in the 1980s and repeated and refined very many times since. Studies described by the neurophysiologist and philosopher Patrick Haggard as one of the philosophically most challenging studies in modern scientific psychology. They have been widely discussed in the media. What these studies seem to show is that our brain makes decisions to act before our conscious mind is aware of them. So they're not really our decisions at all. In a typical experiment, Libet's subjects are asked to do something very simple, to make a simple movement, to bend their right wrist or the fingers of their right hand, in their own time. So it's a free act, it appears. Using brainwave recording, the experimenter records a particular activity in the brain that indicates that the subject is ready to move. This is a so-called readiness potential, or RP. For those who are interested, it's seen in the part of the cerebral cortex most closely associated with voluntary movement. But here was the cunning part of the experiment. Libet also asked his subjects to recall the position of a spot revolving round a clock face at the time when they were first aware of their urge or intention to make a movement. To his surprise, he found that the readiness potential occurred consistently a third of a second before the time at which the subjects reported being aware of having made a decision to move. He concluded from this that the brain, not the subject or the person, decided to initiate, or at least to prepare to initiate this act, before there was any reportable subjective awareness of a decision having been made. But more simply, the cerebral accompaniment of our actions seem to occur before our conscious awareness of deciding to perform them. More recently, John Dillon Hayes and his colleagues carried out studies in which successions of letters were displayed on a screen. Subjects were asked to press a left or a right button at the moment of their own choosing, and to note the letter which was being displayed on the screen at the time they felt they were making a decision to press the button. The letter was a kind of time marker. Two regions that lit up in the brain predicted the subject's choice of left or right button. Remarkably, the relevant regions lit up a full 5 seconds before the individual was aware of having to decided to move the left or the right. And in fact, if you take account of other factors, it would appear that scientists could, as it were, anticipate whether the person was going to move their left or right hand a full 10 seconds before they were themselves aware of having made the choice. The authors concluded that there was a network of high-level control areas that begins to prepare an upcoming decision long before it enters awareness. It looks like, in other words, we don't know what we're going to do until we've found that we've done it. From these and many other experiments, Daniel Wegner has concluded that the only connection between willing and acting is that they both come from the same unconscious source. Hold on a moment. The actions of the subjects were asked to perform in both experiments were the simplest imaginable: a flexing of a wrist, a pressing a button. But that movement was only a minute part of a very long sequence of movements amounting to a large-scale action which could be described as taking part in Dr. Libet's experiment. This large-scale action began at least as far back as getting up in the morning to visit Dr. Libet's laboratory, after perhaps setting the alarm to make sure one wasn't late. It involved consenting to take part in a procedure whose nature and purpose and safety and so on was fully understood, and required, among many other things, listening to and understanding and agreeing to the instructions that were received, and then, and only then, deciding to flex the wrist. In other words, the immediate prior intention, the psychological event timed by Libet, was not the whole story of the action, only a timed part of it. It was preceded by many others that were minutes, perhaps hours, perhaps days before the action. The real story is not just the flexing of the wrist, but of a sustained and complex resolve maintained over a very long time. Once this is appreciated, then the temporal relation in, say, Libet's experiment between the last step, the wrist flexing, and the readiness potential seen in the lab becomes totally unimportant. The flexing of the wrist is just the last component of this action called taking part in Dr. Libet's experiment, which might itself be part of a greater intentional whole, such as wanting to please that nice Dr. Libet, or indeed wanting to help those clever scientists understand the brain, as it might one day help doctors to treat my child's brain injury more effectively. Libet's experimental design illustrates how the Neuromania case against freedom, only demonstrating that we are our brains and our brains are calling the shots, is rooted in a very distorted conception of what constitutes an action in everyday life. If you want to make voluntary actions seem involuntary, the first thing to do is to strip away their context, burn off the self from which they originate, the nexus of meanings that is the world to which they are addressed, and then break them down into their physical elements. This gets you well on the way to eliminating the difference between a twitch and a deliberate action, and makes an action seem as if it could be explained by a burst of nerve impulses embedded in a no-person neural reality rather than in a first-person world where behavior is not atomic but interconnected. The locus of our free will is not individual intentions attached to individual movements. It is a whole field of intention rooted in the self and its world that extends beyond the given movement. So much for the empirical evidence that seems, apparently we're told, to support the assumption that human consciousness that motivates behavior boils down to neural activity. In fact, of course, it is based on the assumption that consciousness is neural activity. And I want to subject this assumption directly now to criticism. My criticism is based upon this inescapable fact. When we're talking about the brain, we're talking about a piece of matter subject to the laws of physics. This is what Daniel Dennett, a leading opponent of neuromania, and someone who in fact has described me as the poor man's John Searle, pointed out. There's only one stuff, he said, matter. The physical stuff of physics, chemistry and physiology, the kind of stuff you can do business with. And the mind is somehow nothing but a physical phenomenon. In short, the mind is the brain, and we can, in principle, account for every mental phenomenon using the same physical principles, laws and raw materials that suffice to explain radioactivity, continental drift, photosynthesis, reproduction, nutrition and growth. Now if we keep this claim in mind, which Dennett says is absolute orthodoxy, we have enough ammunition to demonstrate the necessary failure of neuroscientific accounts of human consciousness and conscious behavior. My central message is this. If we have serious problems understanding the relationship between brain and even ground floor consciousness, it's absurd to look to brain science to cast light on the upper stories of human consciousness. That's why I'm going to focus on the basic level, and why I'm going to take you through some philosophical arguments which at times might seem a bit hard going. In other words, it's going to get even worse in the next 5 minutes. Blame your suffering in the next 5 minutes or so of my talk on the neuromaniacs, and those of you who wish to have a little invocation, I will totally support you in that in your request. So let's begin on the ground floor with perception as it is experienced in humans. The explicit sense of being aware of something other than oneself. An explicit sense that is unique to this particular primate. We can talk perhaps to what extent chimpanzees and other primates have a sense of objects existing independently of themselves. Basically, they don't. Chimpanzees are largely Berkeleans. Objects exist only so far as they're perceived. Now, consider this person's awareness of the glass in front of her. The standard account says that her perception of the glass is the result of the light reflected from the glass entering her eyes and triggering activity in her visual pathways. That's the upper arrow, the upper blue arrow. There is an unbroken causal chain connecting the glass with neural activity in her brain. This chain of cause and effects is entirely compatible with physical science. Unfortunately for neuromania, the inward causal path doesn't deliver the person's awareness of the glass as an item explicitly separate from her, as over there with respect to herself, who's over here. There's nothing in the activity of the visual cortex, nerve impulses that are material objects in a material world, which would make that activity be about the thing that she sees, about something other than herself. The inward causal chain explains how the light gets into her brain and tickles up her neurons, but not how this results in a gaze that looks out. In other words, we have something fundamental that's left unexplained. What philosophers call intentionality, which I can't emphasize too strongly, is only fully developed, would appear, in human consciousness. The intentionality that makes the activity in the visual cortex be about the glass. Intentionality is utterly mysterious, not the least because, as you can see, it points in the opposite direction to causality, in the opposite direction to the causal chain that passes into the visual cortex. It's not feedback or reverse causation, rather it is something that opens up an otherwise causally closed world and makes that world something an agent can operate on. Now, if neuromania were true, my perception of the glass would require the neural activity in the visual cortex to reach causally upstream to the ancestors of the events that cause them. And this is inexplicable in material terms, and crucially, for my argument, it is, as I said, most explicitly developed in human perception. Now, focusing on intentionality brings us to the heart of the trouble that the neural theory of perception and higher consciousness is in. Its central claim that the material interaction between two material objects, say the brain and the glass, will cause one object to appear to the other. The counter-causal direction of intentionality not only shows that this cannot be accommodated in physical science, the ultimate parent of neuroscience, but that appearance is not something that the material world, as seen through the eyes of science and nexus of causation, affords. What's more, the brain, being a piece of matter, must be person-free. No wonder neuroscience can't find the self or the conscious agent in the person-free brain. And this is true not only in the fundamental sense I've just highlighted, but a less fundamental but no less important sense. Persons or selves, you and me, have many features, but there are two of them that are particularly striking that can't be captured in neural terms. Unity in multiplicity and temporal depth. And I want to touch briefly on both of these. First, unity in multiplicity. At any given moment, I'm aware of a multitude of experiences, of sensations, perceptions, memories, thoughts, emotions. I am not merely conscious of them, I am co-conscious of them. They are, that is to say, integrated into a unity of sorts. Now, it's difficult to see how this integration is possible, since neurophysiology assigns them to spatially different parts of the brain. Aspects of consciousness, we are told, are kept very tidily apart. The pathways for perception are separate from those for emotion, which are separate from those for memory, which are separate from those for motivation. Within perception, vision, hearing, and smell have different pathways and different destinations. And within visual perception, different parts of the brain, we are told, are supposed to be responsible for receiving, say, the colour, or the shape, or the distance, or the classification, or the purpose, or the emotional significance of a seen object. When, however, I see my hat on the table over there, and I see that it's squashed, and I feel cross about it, while I hear somebody laughing, and I recognise the laughter as yours, and I'm upset, and I know that the taxi I've ordered has arrived, so I can catch the train that I'm aware I mustn't miss, many things that are kept apart must somehow be brought together. There's absolutely no model of such synthesis in the brain. And this has been described as the binding problem. Various solutions have been offered: widespread synchronized discharges in the cortex, electromagnetic fields, even quantum coherence, which actually lasts only 10 to the minus 43 seconds, no, 10 to the minus 18 seconds, which is shorter than the attention span of a teenager. But none of these means works. And the reason is, none of the means of explaining this works, because you've not only got to bring things together, you've got to keep them apart. Theologians have exercised themselves over the Trinity and the Three in One as an absolute cinch, with my moments of consciousness and all its elements. So much for the unity of the moments of consciousness. But then there's another kind of unity. It's unity over time. It's unity over explicit time. It's my sense of having temporal depth. The human subject is uniquely aware of an explicit past, my own past and a shared past, my memories and history, and reaches into a future, my own future and a shared future. But for simplicity's sake, let's just focus on the past. Now, there are many physiological accounts of memory, but they have one thing in common. They see memory, to use Bergson's sardonic term, they see memory as a kind of cerebral deposit. Memory is, to use the usual but slippery term, stored in the effects that experiences have had on the brain, expressed in the altered reactivity of the brain. This has been demonstrated to the satisfaction of many neurophysiologists and cognitive neuroscientists in creatures as disparate as apes, chick embryos and fruit flies. Some of the most lauded work on memory, which won Eric Kandel his 2000 Nobel Prize, has been on, wait for it, the sea slug. And he's very wise in choosing the sea slug, partly because it's a very simple nervous system, but also it's very ugly, so the Animal Liberation Front won't be able to get into trouble. The failure of neurophysiological accounts of memory is a theme for talk in itself. Sea slugs, for example, do not, as far as I know, experience nostalgia at how life was before they met Eric Kandel and had him electrifying or frying their rear ends. But there's something much more profound in the failure of a materialist account of memory. A putative neural account of memory can't deal with the difference between perceptions and memories because there is no tense, no past tense, or indeed future tense in the material world. As Einstein said in a famous letter to the widow of his wife, Miguel Besso, the letter, shall we say, was not exactly a masterpiece of tact. As Einstein said, "Don't worry, old fruit. She's dead, of course, but know that the distinction between past, present and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion." Not a great comfort, I think, for a widow. But the point is that tenses are not present in the material world. A material object, like a brain, is at any given time, is what it is at that time. What's more, material objects have no now that draw explicitly on a past or reach explicitly to a future, in part modelled in the past. My present moment is pregnant with a past that I in part construct for myself through narrative and is directed towards the future. Now, there are many more philosophical problems with neuromania, but I guess you've had enough of them. And enough, I hope, to convince you of its invalidity, and in particular of the invalidity of the particular idea that human consciousness is identical with neural activity, so that brain science is the key to understanding of humanity. But once we've established that mind and brain activity are not identical, then we've also pulled the rug from beneath Darwinitis, since the mind ceases to be merely something that has co-evolved with the brain. Darwinitis, however, deserves some brief attention of its own, because it's such a dominant presence in popular thinking about ourselves. The notion that we are just animals, and that the difference between human life in the library and animal life in the jungle are more apparent than real, at the most matters of degree rather than kind, has entered popular consciousness. Now, it's a big mistake to combat this view by appealing to high-end activities, saying, well, chimps don't compose symphonies, or don't worship gods, they don't fret over transfinite numbers. They're looking in the wrong place. The difference between ourselves and beasts are wall to wall, and they relate as much to those things that seem to be mirrored in animal behaviour as to those in which we are most obviously unique. For we humans take the biological givens and transform them out of all recognition. And I want to illustrate this with two fairly homely examples: eating and learning. First, eating or feeding. Supposing you invite me out for a meal. Having learned you've just taken on a big loan for a house which has turned into a mound of negative equity, I choose the cheapest items on the menu and falsely declare, patting my stomach, that I'm full after the main course, so as to spare the expense of pudding. A chimpanzee gives a banana to another chimpanzee who eats it. Darwinitics would like to say that both the chimp and I are doing pretty well identical things because we're both exhibiting feeding behaviour. But this identity description obscures huge differences between the chimp's behaviour and mine. What's more, anyone who's acquainted with the most routine dinner table, the product of a vast number of deliberate actions on the part of those sitting round it, will be on their guard when they hear the phrase feeding behaviour applied to both humans and non-human beasts. An ordinary meal is the endpoint of a long journey away from biology. Cooking, eating regulated by the clock and the calendar, the complex structure of meals, and the grammar of what goes with what, kind of thing Levi-Strauss thought about, the ritualistic, symbolic, and celebratory aspects of eating, the multitude of items of tableware that have come from near and far, the journeys taken by the food to the table, the journeys undertaken by those who gathered around the table, and so on and so forth. These are but a few of the ways in which human dining is distanced from animal eating. These are all increasingly sophisticated aspects of man, the animal who does things explicitly, and whose natural medium is a community of minds extending geographically across the globe and historically into the accumulative consciousness of the human race. The laid and laden table draws on 4/4 of the earth and great tracts of past and present human consciousness. Next, learning behaviour. Here's a fairly ordinary example. I decide to improve my career prospects by signing up for a degree course which begins next year. I have a small child. I therefore do more babysitting this year in order to stockpile some tokens. Now, Daisy the cow bumps into electric wire and gets a nasty shock in her rear end and henceforth avoids that place. Now, it could be said that both Daisy and I have been exhibiting learning behaviour, but again, I hope you'll agree, the difference between the two forms of behaviour is greater than the similarities. The examples I've given illustrate something important and unique about human learning. It is not something that merely happens. It is something that has to be done and organised. And this is connected with the fact that humans practice skills and practice memorisation, while animals don't. What's more, animals don't teach their young, or not outside of Disneyland anyway. Human learning is a collective exercise and is mediated by institutions and involves not merely being shaped by experience, but acquiring factual knowledge. What is more, learning for humans is part of a narrative of a life that is led, rather than a life that is merely organically lived. Now, there's something very big behind all this, the human world. This world is woven out of shared attention, out of 1 trillion cognitive handshakes. It is a semiosphere, a realm of signs and meanings, quite remote from the biosphere in which all other sentient beings live and have their being. Most of our actions in daily life, however concrete, typically make sense only with respect to frameworks of which we are conscious, which incorporate many layers of abstraction. Really think of all the steps you took to get to this talk this evening, beginning with the moment perhaps a few weeks ago when you saw today's programme. None of these frames of reference has any counterpart in the life of beasts. This world, with its frameworks of often abstract understanding, or understanding mediated by abstractions, transcends the organism Homo sapiens, as it was delivered by Darwinian processes hundreds of thousands of years ago. These hundreds of thousands of years are the measure of how far Darwinitis, which sees us as simply as other primates, is out of date. We have stepped outside of our organic bodies into a domain where things are made explicit. In that domain, uniquely we guide, justify and excuse our behaviour according to general and abstract principles. We create cities, laws and institutions. We entertain theories even about our own nature and about the world, frame our individual lives within a shared history, and systematically inquire into the order of things and the patterns of causation and physical laws that seem to underpin that order. These phenomena, albeit profound and complex and pervasive, are merely surface manifestations or symptoms of something even more profound, complex and pervasive. Namely, that we are explicit animals who lead our lives, living out shared and individual narratives rather than merely living them, who are conscious of ourselves and of others, and indeed of the material world, the material objects, and its intrinsic existence and its properties in the way that no animal does. V.S. Ramachandran, a neuroscientist, surely spoke truly when he asserted that humanity transcends apehood to the same degree by which life transcends mundane chemistry and physics. This seems so obvious, it's difficult to see why so many thinkers so stubbornly insist on overlooking what's in front of their noses. And this is something perhaps we might discuss in Q&A. But it is time, ladies and gentlemen, you'll be glad to learn, for me to start winding up. I've examined and found wanting what seems to be one of the most widely received ideas of our time. Namely, that biology is the key to human nature, that we are best understood as largely unconscious organisms, or unconscious or programmed organisms, operating in a natural world, rather than as conscious agents, acting in a uniquely human one. The consequences of this biologism, as I have called it, will be, if understood, will be appalling. Biologism is propped up by these two pillars of unwisdom, Neuromania and Darwinitis. And I hope you are sufficiently persuaded by my arguments to agree the most appropriate place for these ideas is shown on the slide. Now you may think that no one takes them serious enough to follow them to their conclusions. But even if this were so, then the ideas would still be important as obstacles in our trying to understand our nature in a way that doesn't invoke supernatural explanations. For me, an atheist but also humanist, naturalistic or biologistic accounts are unsatisfactory and as imprisoning as supernatural ones. A great and exciting challenge confronts us in trying to make sense of ourselves, and Neuromania and Darwinitis just get in the way. And they may be worse than merely obstructive, even obstructive, stopping us even starting to think. They may actually be dangerous. For example, John Gray, whom you see on the slide there, looking a bit ferocious, a celebrity misanthrope, has argued in his best-selling Straw Dogs and a pile of equally boring books afterwards that Darwin, he said, has demonstrated that we are not particularly special. Human life has no more meaning than that of a slime mold. Man is only one of many species and not obviously worth preserving. Speak for yourself, mate. But, ladies and gentlemen, ideas have consequences. Abstract arguments that might begin by looking like harmless puppies may grow up to be like something else. That's why I've ridden this hobby horse for so long and so hard. It is time, you'll be glad to learn, for me to start to wind up. As the late, great Humphrey Lyttelton might have said, I hear the tortoise of time exploding in the microwave of eternity. Suffice it to say that those who try to explain love, conscience, human institutions by describing what they find when they peer into the brain are like someone who applies a stethoscope, this item, this acorn, and hopes to hear the rustling of the breezes in the oak forest. Neuromaniacs and Darwinitics are trying to find the community of minds forged from a trillion cognitive handshakes in bits of the standalone brain, lighting up in the intracranial darkness. I ought to end by emphasizing I have no problem with biology. I'm a doctor whose treatments have depended on biological science when they were any good. I spent 30 or more years adding my small, minute grains of truth to the great monument that is clinical neuroscience. And I don't have a religious agenda, as I guess will be apparent. I'm an atheist humanist, as I've said, nor am I crazy enough to question Darwin's theory of evolution. I'm not a creationist nutter. And finally, by the way, I'm not a dualist. I'm not one who thinks of the mind as being like a ghost in a meat machine. And this gives me the cue for the final thought, from the philosopher Gilbert Ryle in his classic The Concept of Mind. Man, he said, need not be degraded to a machine by being denied to be a ghost in the machine. He might, after all, be a sort of animal, namely a higher mammal. A higher mammal. There has yet to be ventured the hazardous leap of the hypothesis that perhaps he is man. And I think it's time we took that hazardous leap. So there you are. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention, or at least for so courteously simulating it. I hope you feel that I have said something worth listening to, and I very much look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Ray. That was excellent, and I'm pretty sure that we weren't simulating our attention. At this point, I'd like to introduce Andrew Bartlett, who comes from Kwantlen Polytechnic University. He's in the English department there, and he was instrumental in contacting Ray and seducing him to come to our conference. And at this point, I'd just like to bring him to the podium.
Thanks, Richard. Good to see you all here. I'm just going to talk for about 5 minutes, and then Eric will come up and have a conversation with Raymond. I just have 2 questions. Just deliver them, and then I'll sit down and come up. So, I must speak personally first, Dr. Tallis. I feel a deep honor to be the one responding to your lecture. I first discovered your work in 2011, as you know. Aping Mankind knocked my socks off. That spring at GASC 5 at High Point, University of North Carolina, I began to advertise to my fellow GA stalwarts the not-to-be-lost opportunities for intellectual cross-fertilization between your ideas and those of Eric Gans. To have you here on the scene of GASC 8 as your agentive, conscious, embodied, freely willing, irreducibly personal self is a wonderful thing. To witness what you can do when you are permitted to feed us more than 1 banana each, and to witness what you can do when you are free to exercise more than your right wrist and the mental powers needed to tell us the ticking second at which you flexed it, to witness what you can produce as a free thinker is a joy. So thank you for taking the time and energy to be with us. 2 questions. My first one. The first is on a certain tension between reason as a mode of access to a true grasp of the world, and experiences of the sacred and experiences of the aesthetic as modes of access to a true grasp or an accurate grasp of the world. So early in your talk, you explicitly rejected any, quote, supernatural or broadly religious account, end quote, of humankind's origin and condition. I don't want to appear nitpicking about marginalia in the gleefully impudent manner of a faux sophisticated deconstructive reader, but the phrasing supernatural or broadly religious might imply too close a similarity between a religious account and supernatural account. Toward the end of the lecture, again, you reminded us that you're, quote, trying to understand our nature in a way that doesn't invoke supernatural explanations, end quote. So I'm wondering if you could specify what exactly it is you eschew in or mean by supernatural explanations, especially insofar as you are willing to use a quasi-mystical vocabulary when saying, for example, that intentionality is, quote-unquote, utterly mysterious. I wonder, continuing the same question, elaborating on it, if you might not agree that to reject sacred texts as sources of anthropological truth, not truth about the material world, but anthropological truth, due to their status as not yet legally divorced from the supernatural, is to risk throwing out the baby with the bathwater. And I'm not speaking of simply demythologizing religious texts to domesticate them as attractive prop-ups for a segregationist secular morality or ethics as a source of nice examples of good conduct some of the time. You certainly hold beliefs such as these 3 to be true. 1, humans are irreducibly persons with first-person being. 2, humans are responsible agents with free will. 3, we can understand humans only as situated members of communities who create collective meanings in a semiosphere. Is it not perhaps ironic that those very beliefs have never been questioned by sacred texts or aesthetic texts, art and religion, while they have been questioned by certain strains of Enlightenment reason, those strains that have twisted themselves into the anti-human scientism that you quite rightly attack? So to what extent, wrapping up this first question, to what extent, in what way, therefore, might you be open to an epistemology that considers sacred texts or the great works of art, Shakespeare, so not just philosophical texts, not just the discourses of reason, to be genuine sources of reliable truth about human behavior and human reality, social reality? First question is done. We'll be glad to know. Second question. I'm curious as to how you might sharpen the difference between that which we are doing as humans when consciously perceiving phenomena and that which we are doing when consciously representing phenomena in symbolic exchange or sign exchange, the preoccupation of generative anthropology. How for you does the human consciousness of a perceived or appearing object, with appearance, differ from the human consciousness of a represented object, or maybe the appearance of a represented object? What's your theory of language? Nice, easy question. Take a couple of seconds on that one. Your expose of the quasi-Frankensteinian overreaching that is endemic to brain science is, to my mind, delightfully devastating and thorough. That expose of overreaching includes an affirmation of intentionality, as I've already mentioned. Quote, intentionality is utterly mysterious, not least because it points in the opposite direction to causality, end quote. It's beautiful. Similarly, generative anthropology is founded upon a mentalistic intuition of the human that gives intentionality its due weight. Another example of convergence between GA and your thought. You insist on the, quote, the essentially relational aspect of consciousness for which a single player is not enough, end quote. Again, such a formulation is very close, as you know by now, having been here with us, to GA's investment in a fundamentally scenic and multiplayer model of linguistic reality. It would be a painless and satisfying project to make explicit the interrelationships between the relational of Raymond Tallis and the scenic of Eric Gans. Nonetheless, wrapping up the second question, would it not be more parsimonious to find a model of language as that which is unique to the human as opposed to non-human animals, rather than trying to find a description of the specificity of human consciousness? Obviously, non-human animal consciousness includes perception, including in many mammalian species, for example, perception of social others. To quote Adam Katz, one of our colleagues in GA, from his most recent GA blog post where he was responding to your work, quote, we should also remember that neurophenomena are already well recognized as responsive to the environment, so the social nature of non-human consciousness is a given, end quote. I'm wondering how you'd respond to that claim. The social nature of non-human consciousness is a given, end quote. Do you see any conceptual leverage or advantage in putting conscious language as representation in the foreground rather than consciousness alone? Or would such a redistribution of emphasis be excessively disruptive to your way of thinking? That's it. I will seat myself. Eric can come up, and you guys can go for it.
Right, it's smooth view from me.
Oh gosh, I think I need to take legal advice before I try this. It's a bit like the Ten Commandments, you know, it says only 7 to be attempted. In this case, I naught to be attempted. They're both very rich questions, and ones that I feel are totally opposite to the kind of roughly where I'm stuck in many ways. But I'll take the easier question first, because also some of the points you've made will come up, I hope, in the discussion that Eric and I have. So, but what is an animal society as opposed to a human society? It does seem to me that even in primates, they get all sorts of dovetailing activities, they get infectious emotions that pass from one to the other. But what seems to be missing is individually a lacking sustained sense of self that has temporal depth and ascription of a sustained sense of self to the other creature. And without those two things, I don't think you can have the kind of society that we have. You can have spatial organization, you can have dovetailing automaticity, you can have instincts that work very well together, and all sorts of groupings and so on. There's something profoundly missing. I think people have mentioned Tomasello quite a lot. And one of the interesting things that Tomasello found, and he is very, very generous what he describes to his chimps, you know, but he claims that chimps can imagine other chimps having beliefs, but not having false beliefs. But of course you can't have, basically, ascribing beliefs to an animal, to another creature, without entertaining the possibility they might be wrong. So, the answer to the question is, animal societies, even the most sophisticated ones, are quite different kinds of societal models because they are not rooted in the individuals having a sustained sense of self and having a same sense of the other having a self and temporal depth. The other question, I think, goes right to the heart of the matter, but if I can make a printing point and then flash on a slide too. I think it was Borges who once said, I don't appear to have so many beliefs myself, but I'm infinitely fascinated by the beliefs that humanity has had. And anybody who tries to think about human beings without giving religion an absolutely central place in their philosophical anthropology is really missing a trick. So although I try to become an atheist, I probably haven't succeeded actually. It's an unfinished business being an atheist, it's all the time. But I wouldn't in any way diminish the central role of religion in our evolution. Never mind the fantastic legacy of art, architecture, literature, and indeed, science and philosophy both came out of religion now. So I hope for a moment I'm not a sort of Dawkinite who just wants to say, let's get rid of all this and have a brand new start. Because I think the idea of God, for example, is the most profound and terrible idea we've ever had, but certainly the most profound. So that's a sort of, I picked out easier bits to your question. There's some much more profound and more difficult bits. Is that okay for the moment? Do I get a sort of... Well, perhaps because this is a GASC conference, and I was very keen that we should look at, say, the difference between this kind of anti-biologistic view and Eric's very, very interesting account of the originary moment of humanity. I thought I'd basically just identify, first of all, just to be sure if we actually agree. I mean, I think one of the things immediately attracts me about the whole of these 2 days is we're absolutely agreed we're fundamentally different from other beasts. Chimpanzees, basically, are a long way away from us. That much of this difference comes from symbolic signs. And for me, symbolic signs are important in distancing us from nature. There was a very good discussion yesterday about indexical signs. These are signs, basically, that operate through causation. There's a causal connection. If I look at a cloud and expect rain, that's because there's a causal connection between clouds and rain. And those are, if you like, natural signs. Natural signs. The sort of signs we're dealing with all the time don't have that causal connection. Our meanings are, the meanings we get from each other, the meant meanings we transmit to each other, aren't causally connected in that sort of way. And to me, symbolic signs are absolutely central in the progressive distance we have established from the causal net, the material world, making full-blown agents possible. I'll come back to that in a second, but thirdly, there is this question which I resonate to, that Eric and GASC GA people have made a lot of, which I totally support, is the difference between appetite, animal appetite and human desire. Basically, they are absolutely fundamentally. I published a book called Hunger, which has a whole chapter on the difference between appetite and desire, because desire is utterly unique to humanity. So these are areas, I guess, do you feel we agree on that?
Oh, yeah. Well, you really haven't said, aside from the sort of points that Andrew has made, which he made very masterfully, and I feel a bit ashamed to take over his spot here, but I guess age, that's something. But no, I don't think I heard a single word that you said today that I wouldn't agree with, aside from, well, you say that you're an atheist. Well, I mean, I consider myself an atheist too, but I probably have a little more respect for religion than you, and I probably focus a little more intensely on the sign as opposed to what you would call consciousness. And I thought, Andrew's second question, at least the first part of it was really a couple of questions, but the idea that it's sort of more parsimonious to think, animal plus sign system equals human, and try to reduce the difference to that, and then derive the aspects of consciousness that you were just talking about from the fact that we do have signs. And in a way, I think that's the fulfillment of the philosophical project. That's why I always go back to dear old Sartre's néant. In a way, the néant is nothing, and so it's sort of the bankruptcy of metaphysics. If all the metaphysics can tell you is that what's the difference between us, the pour soi, and the en soi, the difference between humans and the rest of the world is nothing.
It's a very muscular nothing in such.
It's a very muscular nothing, but I like that. I come from a generation when Sartre was really important, and then afterwards everyone was deconstructing him, and of course he made a fool of himself politically. But I like Sartre better than Heidegger. I'd say that if I had to choose, I think Sartre gets rid of all the kind of misty Black Forest. Anyway,
already the dark clouds of disagreement are gathering, because I read a monograph on being in time, and I feel that behind it is
well,
a great...
being in time is okay. The later stuff, but in any case, let's not argue with that. But I mean, I think that basically, I don't think I couldn't agree with you more, and I'm very happy to hear somebody, who doesn't go along with Dawkins and all that kind of facile type of, God is bad and that kind of thing. And so I really very happy to be talking to you, because I don't think we disagree very much at all.
And on the point about the Dawkins approach, I mean, it seems to me it is completely wrong to become an atheist because priests behave badly or religion has caused sorrow, for two reasons. One is you couldn't run the tape twice and find out whether history would be better with and without religion, so you can't make the comparison. And secondly, we know that religion has brought many extraordinary things, not the least science. The idea of uniformity of nature is perhaps a spin-off from monotheism and so on. But should we move to disagreement?
Well,
Yeah, because in a sense you were sort of touching on it in your comments. One thing I didn't touch on in my talk was why I felt how we came to be so different. And this is where I'm probably the world's least original philosopher, because the argument I have goes all the way back to, not Anaximander, one of the pre-Socratics who I've forgotten, Aristotle, and also Aristotle and Kant and so on, which is that the opposable thumb, the upright position, change in our gaze, produced a different relationship to our own body, as a result of which the hand became a kind of tool. And that was, as Aristotle would say, the tool of tools, the tool. And this, I think, really deals with where we disagree. Because, and I may have got this wrong, Eric and the GA group feel very much that language is, and symbolic language, which I think is close to what we mean by language in the narrow sense, is the main trigger and driver for our increasing distance from our primate cousins. I think it goes back earlier than that. I think it goes back to our gradually becoming explicit animals. Animals who are aware of themselves as embodied subjects, as agents, who are aware of particularly parts of the body, such as their hands, as the agents of their agency, who have genuine tools, and I think tool use in animals is largely metaphorical. And those tools, it seems to me, are proto-linguistic symbols and signs. A tool out there is an externalization of a need that we all have in common, or potentially. I think for you, the key moment occurs much later. For me, the key moment goes back to the pedal chopper 2.8 million years ago. I think you wouldn't go that far back.
I've never been too sure exactly when my originary scene would have taken place. And in a way, of course, in a sense it doesn't matter, because in a sense it's a model. It isn't an event that I think we can point to. It's a model of an event, but it's based on the idea that since we live in the world of events, there had to be a first event. There had to be a moment when we used the sign that we could recollect afterward and thereby reproduce the event and even, if you like, think about the event. And this is something that had to take place fairly early. And I once wrote a paper, I think, and maybe an article, or maybe one of my chronicles, where I talked about the early origin of the human. In other words, I'm not talking about language in the sense of, that we would have it 50,000 years ago, when you had a fairly presumably a modern vocal tract and you could articulate sounds. Because, I mean, it's sort of obvious. I don't know why people even argue about this. You can't imagine, unless you're some kind of a Chomskyan who thinks that, the humans were all getting ready for language, and then there was a mutation. And then that mutation, one person started speaking, and maybe that didn't work. But then next year, there were two people who had the same mutation, and then they could start speaking. And since then, it's all been, flowers and joy. But seriously, I think that the first, if you look at my scenario for the origin of language, it doesn't involve any kind of specialized vocal apparatus. And what it does involve is pointing. So I don't really see, if you think about it, my idea of the first word is essentially pointing. It's essentially the idea or a kind of a fancy version of pointing in any case. The idea that reaching for the object, which is not a symbolic gesture, becomes turned into a symbolic gesture by the fact that the presence of the others prevent me from grasping, and at that point it becomes pointing, because the gesture toward is a way of designating the object as something that I don't intend to possess, because if I did, the others might do violence to me. And so that, I think, would allow for a very nice synthesis of your view. I'm familiar with your book on the hand, which is a beautiful work, and then he also wrote a book on Michelangelo's finger, which is a kind of, there's some religious temptation there at the very least. We wrote a whole book on God's finger,
It was the publisher who chose the title of this case.
Well, but still.
It sold 10 copies instead of 5. So but I think this is a point of real convergence, I think, because to me pointing is something absolutely extraordinary, as it is very much for Eric. It is shared attention. I mean, by the way, chimps in the wild don't point. Jane Goodall, in 35 years of watching chimps, didn't see them point. And in order to point, you really have to have a lot of cognitive infrastructure. You have to have the sense that another person doesn't know something that you know. You have to have a sense that you're sharing a field, a space. You have to also have a sense that your own limbs can be used as indicators and so on. So I think that we would be much closer together if we both felt that pointing was a very early.
Here's a way of adding to your explanation. I noticed toward the end of your talk you pointed out that the mind is not something, or that the human consciousness is not something that you can locate in a single brain. Well, that's one of the problems with language, and with the language philosophers for that matter. They always seem to think that, you can take somebody and put them in a box and say, okay, now we're going to find out what language is, and in a way it's not that different from some of these Neuromania people, except they are using language. But, you can't deal with language and say, what is the meaning of something if you just concentrate on one person. Language isn't in my brain. Language is a set of obviously there's all kinds of neurons in there, but it's a set of reactions that depend on a linguistic community. And you can go into a room and you don't forget your language, but you didn't learn language that way, and you certainly can't maintain language very well that way. Language is a communal thing. And so my idea about pointing would be the same thing. It's not just that my ability to point is something that evolves as a sort of my ability. It's the idea that pointing involves joint attention, and therefore it involves a moment. Instead of just saying it evolves, I would say it involves this moment when grasping for the object, which is what you normally do, becomes impossible. And then you realize, and as Adam Katz puts it, only one person would probably realize it first, but in any case, somebody realizes that reaching for the object is not going to work. It's too dangerous. And so instead of simply pulling back and rejecting, it's an aborted gesture. In other words, it's a gesture of appropriation that is turned into a sign. And at that point, that's really what pointing is, because then you realize that by making the gesture, I'm telling the others that I am not appropriating the object, but yet I'm designating the object. And I think that that would be an origin of language that you might even accept, because it pays homage to your intuition, and not just intuition, but your study of the pointing gesture as essentially human. Because otherwise, in a sense, it is absurd, isn't it? Why can't a chimpanzee point? They have hands. I mean, most people, if you ask most people on the street, I venture to say they think that chimpanzees can point.
Yeah. And that's interesting. I mean, chimpanzees in the wild, in captivity, sometimes do point, but they can't understand pointing, which indicates they're not really pointing. But it's interesting that pointing with children, there are two dimensions to pointing. One is declarative pointing, when you're sharing something with your mother or whatever, doggy, that sort of thing. And there's imperative pointing, which basically means I want that chocolate. And I think both of those aspects occur, interestingly, at the same time in humans. I can't remember. Can I just check whether I had anything? Yes. Now, one of the interesting things, it seems to me, and I hope I got this right, with an explanation, is that humans are uniquely a threat to their own species. So they have an urgency in finding ways of diffusing potential violence. And one of those, of course, is the abortive program.
But you disagree with this?
I think humans are uniquely a threat to their own species, but I don't think that's the first thing. They're no more violent intrinsically to chimps than chimps are, but it's because they have other cognitive properties that their violence becomes much more dangerous. In other words, there's an awful lot of us that's different from chimps to turn our violent propensities into something potentially genocidal.
But that's perfectly, that's exactly, let's say, the Girardian point. Girard, I think, because he doesn't have a theory of language, he never can quite understand how you get from the animal to the human. But his intuition, let's say the basis of his intuition is that the increase in mimesis, or if you like, just in intelligence, the fact that the human brain, that the proto-human brain gets more intelligent and therefore more able to imitate, and that the more able you are to imitate others, the more able you are to imitate their desires, and therefore the more likely you are to come in conflict with them, because you will see the other proto-human grasping something and you will want to get it too. And just to, for those of you who I haven't already bored with this, you know, the idea is that you have an alpha-beta system of pecking order hierarchy, which isn't really a social organization, but it's a kind of one-on-one system where the most powerful animal takes the first bite and so on, and then after he's finished what he has, then the second one goes, and so on. But the mimetic tension in the group would be too great for the alpha animal to simply be able to walk in and take the first piece, because they'd all want it. And at that point, they'd all realize that, well, you know, he's just one animal, and we want it as much as he does. And that would lead to crisis. And then the idea of the abortive gesture would be the solution, as language is a solution to the crisis. But I think that that also follows exactly what you have there. We have a higher degree of intelligence, and therefore our conflicts would be the result of this greater mimetic capacity. And this is also a way of paying homage to Girard, because I think that is his sort of most fundamental intuition.
Good. So I think in many ways the points of disagreement are disappointingly turning into, I mean, obviously, you know, all the violence has gone out of the situation. It's just dreadful. You're hoping for a bear fight, you know, you're hoping for a dog fight, weren't you? No, but I'm sorry to, you can have your money back at the end. I suppose the final point there, if I may, is the sacred-profane distinction. Now, we've just already discussed how important religion is, and it does seem to be very important, but in terms of, as it were, cognitive differences, going right back to the beginning, between the human primate and other primates, I just wonder whether sacred profane really is the only binary we need, whether it is the initial one. Because the sense of the transcendent, a shared sense of the transcendent, is quite a sophisticated sort of thing, of the kind of transcendence we think of in relation to the different sacred profane. But I guess...
Well, you know pretty much what I would say in answer to this, right? That once you can't appropriate the object that you want to appropriate, this is where you get the sattva's néant, the separation, and at the same time that's the separation of the sacred. That's why, you know, when Girard talks about violence and the sacred, and he says violence is the sacred, you know, using the A and so on. But no, violence is deferred sacredness. It's the sacred that one can't appropriate, and therefore, the sacred is the violent, is the object of a potentially violent desire that is renounced, at least for the moment, in order to preserve the group, but then the object appears to have this numinous quality that prevents us from appropriating it. And I think beauty has that effect on us in general, if you want to think about it in a secular way, you know. But something really beautiful and certainly something appetitively as attractive as some, you know, body of an animal when you're hungry and you've been hunting in the cold for certain, well, maybe not the cold, but in any case, for a certain amount of time, and you come across this, and you know, I don't want that alpha animal to just jump in there and And so how do we resolve this problem? And if we resolve it by a kind of a designation, then afterward we all become equal partners in this because we're all sharing this sign. And then when we can divide it up in the way that, I always imagine the famous Robertson Smith camel sacrifice. But I mean, those things are tested, I think, even today in certain hunter-gatherer societies. And they always try to share things equally. So that way, the sacred would come out of that. Now, that's a very crude kind of sacred. It isn't some sense of transcendence, but the sign remains after the thing's there. And then you have this sort of memory that the sign that produced this somehow corresponds to this delicious animal that I was able to enjoy because of the sign that preceded it, that allowed the thing to proceed in peace. And so I think that's where Girard's idea that the sacred is a source of peace and also a source of violence, that's the way to finesse that kind of dichotomy. So I think that explains the origin of religion, but obviously it doesn't give you the whole development of religion.
I suppose as you're talking, it does seem to me, I guess, there is a sense in which the sacred is untouchable except under highly regulated conditions, and it's having the thing which you normally reach out for and grab becomes untouchable except by permission of the group. That is the beginning. It gives me a sense of an inchoate sense of something that's rather sacred. It mustn't be violated.
I think that we have a sense that there's a basis of agreement here.
This is very disappointing. I'm very sorry about that.
Perhaps it would be a good point, because please both stay up, but if there are questions from the audience, I can act as a Yes, so is it Keith and then Chris?
Yeah, I had a question. I mean, Eric touched on this, referring to Girard, and I was just curious because it was a piece that you clearly have sort of worked into your thinking, but it wasn't mentioned explicitly. So when you're talking about gradualism and just a different sort of evolutionary pathway, how do you see proto-human, pre-human species that come into the point where there would be a difference between humans playing into this? I mean, it seemed like you were sort of agreeing with some of the things that Eric was saying about Girard's speculation about this, but I was just curious about exactly the way you see that.
I mean, I haven't had a chance, in a sense, to assimilate Eric's ideas and try and work out, but my just so story, for what it's worth, and it's not particularly testable. I mean, I can't challenge Eric on the testability of his theories because I can't test mine as well. But there were several clearly distinct features of Homo sapiens, and there were certain situations. And the standard story, which is massively unoriginal, is that several things happened. First of all, we have an opposable thumb, a fully opposable thumb, which transforms the hand amazingly, and I talk about it a great deal, what opposability thumb does. And in particular, it does bring it to the threshold of it becoming an agent of your agency, which then gives you the sense of being an embodied agent. But at the same time, because of the migration, probably because of climatic changes, the migration of Homo sapiens out into the savannah, where the upright position was a much better bet, suddenly the hand was freed from being a locomotive prop to a free explorer of space, and indeed explorer of itself. There are differences in human vision, and of course one in the upright position makes vision also very, very much more important, and that's when, of course, joint attention, vision is the sensory modality through which joint attention is mediated. All those three things together, slowly but surely, led to a situation where we became conscious of ourselves in a new sort of way, sustainedly conscious. The sense that I am this, that the existential situation that I am this body gradually emerges, and the sense that you are that body, the sense that objects are independent of me, independent of my experiences, the sense that they have intrinsic properties, that they causally interact with one another. All of that I see as gradually emerging, distancing us further and further from chimpanzees, whose metaphysics is extraordinarily different from ours. There is no evidence they have any sense of causal relations. They have no sense of objects as having a continuous existence. They have no sense, in a sustained way, of other chimpanzees having a theory of mind, of having a self. So those are the anatomical and climatic changes that started a process that I think took a long time. But they speed up every now and then. So when you have your hand as a fully developed agent of your agency, it's easy to see you could have a fully developed sense of a tool. Hence, our tool use is totally different from chimpanzees. What was the height of achievement of a chimpanzee using tools 5 million years ago? Basically using a stone to break open a nut. What is the height of achievement of a chimpanzee using a stone, using tools today? Using a stone to hit a nut. There's no explicit sense of tools in chimpanzees. They do a bit of termite fishing, one to other. But it's a gradual process. That's, I think, probably a residual difference still from Eric's view, which is very much an event. Has that sort of started answering your question? I'm trying to summarize the 1,000 pages of the tradition.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key point of difference, and Eric, I'm sure can spell this out in his own terms, that I see between the two positions is that Eric would argue that he can probably go quite a bit down the road with where these proto-humans are headed. He's certainly done that in the case of Girard's theory, but he's going to argue that at a certain point there's a tipping point from the proto-human into the fully human, which is that emergence of language.
I would put it further back, and I would put it back with, take the pebble chopper. It's an extraordinary device. It's got two aspects to it. One is the end which you grasp, and the other is the business end that does the business.
Okay,
so it's quite a complicated relationship with the world.
So,
sorry, yes. Yeah.
So all right. So in other words, you're saying that you've already got humans, but you don't have language in the sense that Eric's talking about it. So he's going to argue that at a certain point there's also language, and that adds a dramatic transformation to the
and I would kind of agree with that. There have been periods when things have speeded up massively. Of course, writing is another example. It's only 7,000 years old, and serious writing only goes back to 900 BC. But I guess in a way, I think I'm starting further back, but probably because I'm doing something different, perhaps. But I think one thing I've learned is when you're talking about language, you're not really talking about speech.
Not in the modern sense, no.
That parvenu that came 40,000 to 100,000 years ago, by the time we got to speaking this way, whatever, we moved a massive distance from the other primates.
Yeah, I could jump in. The article Eric was referring to, it's the little bang of language.
Yes.
It's in Anthropoetics, and then it was published in Contagion as well under different titles. But my understanding is that the model of the evolution of sign exchange that Eric proposes starts with the originary ostensive, just the abortive gesture.
Yeah.
And that can be back millions of years. And that's what I found, intuitively so exciting about action, because in a sense, your thought about the hand primes proto-humans for all the kinds of awareness that they would need to kind of be ready for the event of recognizing the abortive gesture of appropriation and designating the sacred center. That just can't drop out of the sky. It has to come from a particular kind of animal, and it is the kind of animal you're describing. And in the hand, the awareness of the hand is something separate from the body. There's no conflict there. There's a huge opportunity for continuity.
I think I agree with you. I'm describing the soil, and Eric's describing the seed that lands in the soil. Perhaps,
yeah, that's a lovely metaphor for it. I had a question from the gentleman 2 seats over in the blue. Did you want to go with your question?
Yep.
Oh, okay. Go.
This might be a naive question, but would your worldview fit within a biopsychosocial model, kind of like in the social sciences?
I didn't quite catch the full question. Could you say it again? I beg your pardon.
Would your worldview fit within kind of a biopsychosocial model, like from the social sciences?
Yep, it most certainly would. It certainly wouldn't reduce the psychosocial to the bio. One needs all of those dimensions. Although having said that, it's in human beings, everything bio has been utterly transformed to become psychosocial. Of course, I'm born biologically and I'll perish biologically, and as a doctor I know an awful lot of biological things happen en route, but all of them utterly transformed. The biological givens in us, even the humblest ones, take salivation, the way we deal with our saliva and how we use it for symbolic purposes and so on, everything is transferred. So my model, it would be a biopsychosocial one, but the bio is very much assimilated to the psychosocial, rather than the opposite view, which is the psychosocial is explained through the bio. Is that a reasonable answer to the question? Is that sort of?
Yeah, academically, I grew up in a time in the 60s and 70s where there was a real emphasis on the psychosocial. Mm-hmm. And I can remember, I'm old enough to remember scientists blaming mothers of schizophrenic kids, that they were called refrigerator mothers, that they caused the schizophrenia in their child.
Schizogenic.
We now know that it's really biologically driven.
The refrigerator mother was about autism, usually, and that was, what's his name, the empty fortress man whose name I've forgotten, Bruno Bettelheim. Mm-hmm. Yes, and I agree with you, and that was a terrible burden that people who had children causing them huge problems had to carry that extra burden of being blamed. Yeah. I mean, you can't kick the bio in the end because it kicks me. Look at me, what state I'll be in 100 years' time.
Go ahead, sir. Yes.
Thank you so much for the talk. You brought up Bergson's theory of memory and his critique of storage memory, and it just raises the question: what alternative is there? I mean, if memory is not stored, and perhaps it's not, doesn't that just crack open the door to dualism again? Like, what's the alternative?
It seems to me that we've got to start really, really thinking. I'm not a materialist monist, but I don't want to move from one bankrupt idea to another one that's equally bankrupt, which is dualism. Ghosts in the machine are just hopeless for all sorts of reasons. Nor am I a panpsychist. I mean, some people have given up on explaining why our body's uniquely conscious. What they say is all matter has a little smidgen of consciousness in it and just has to get gathered together a bit more in me than in a pebble. So, pebble doesn't experience resentment like I do. And potatoes in a dark cellar don't have dark thoughts. But actually, it just seems to me that's not very helpful either, because if you distribute mind throughout matter, then you've still got the explanation of why I'm different from a pebble. So substance dualism, property dualism, panpsychism, material monism, all off the menu as far as I'm concerned. Jerry Fodor said something very good in an article a few years ago. He said, in order to deal with understanding the place of mind in the cosmos, we've got to set aside all our cherished and automatic beliefs, all the facilitated pathways we go down when we think about these things. We've got to get rid of them. So in a sense, I'm doing John Locke's job of the humble undergardener clearing the rubbish on the path to truth, waiting for the incomparable Mr. Newton to turn up and provide the positive answers. So people have accused me of being a dualist. I'm not a dualist. No, I've kissed it worse, of course, but I'm not a dualist.
Are you willing to run with the irreducible mind? You're familiar with that work, with transmission theories going back to William James, or is that just off the path too?
I don't think I'm entirely familiar with. I didn't quite catch the phrase you used.
Well, there's a book called Irreducible Mind, which is
Irreducible Mind, yes.
Arguing for a return to William James's notion of the possibility of a transmission theory of consciousness, which is not dualism per se, but I suppose it is a kind of form of panpsychism. Is that off the map too?
Is this the idea of the mind as a sort of radio, at least the brain as a sort of radio receiver?
Yeah.
I find that just as difficult, really, because the harder you look at it, the more it seems almost as bankrupt as the idea that neural activity equals my consciousness. So I think we're waiting for a genius to come along. At the moment, I'm an ontological agnostic praying for a genius.
This is just to add a comment to the previous discussion, whether it was the tool use that came first or language. I remember reading an article. The author was Ralph Holloway, an anthropologist, I believe. And I think the article was from 1992. And he analyzed the specifically human tool use compared to rudimentary tool used by animals. And his claim was that humans use tools in exactly the same fashion as they speak language. There is a grammar of tool use. There is a concatenation and parsing. So, yeah, I don't know what it means, but it seems to be that, you know, maybe what came first, but the structures are the same according to him.
I mean, that's a very interesting point. I mean, it seems to me there's two ways that you can differentiate genuine human tool use from metaphorical animal tool use. One is that only to a very limited extent do animals, any animals, use tools to make tools, so-called secondary tool use. But the most interesting point to me is a point that was made by Köhler, Wolfgang Köhler, the great primatologist, father of Gestalt psychology. From his observations, he felt that animals, when they used tools, quasi-tools, assimilated them entirely into their own bodies. When we use tools, they're an extension of an explicit agency, of an out-there-ness that begins with our own hands.
Yeah, you were talking a moment ago, Raymond, of joint attention, which is getting a lot of attention these days. And it caught my attention because of GA and the circle and the pointing. And my recollection of reading on it is that it is not, joint attention is not unique to our species, is it?
Well,
that's a simple question,
yeah.
But there's a complementary one. Because there's another piece of that, is that the whites of our eyes are extraordinarily large, which allows us to communicate an intention. I mean, this goes in with child development, I'm sure that you know about, you know. And I'm always reminded of this when I see a newborn who can't speak at all. You know how they lock onto your eyes? But that's anecdotal. So my really question is, what you have to offer on joint attention and the sclera, you know, that was 10 years ago reported on, but there's been a lot more since. And what part of our being human, how important is that to it?
I mean, I'll be interested in what Eric said, but okay, well, first of all, my sclera now are yellow in the morning and red at night, so that's busted me for attracting anybody's attention. But there's been a lot of work on gaze and perception of gaze, and chimpanzees being aware of what direction, what another animal would see. And they have a very limited sense of the direction of another animal's gaze. Now, joint attention, clearly, you've got to have the idea that that you can direct where somebody's looking at, and you have a sense of where people are looking. For example, if I'm pointing at something, I've got to be aware of you being aware both of my arm pointing to the object, and then being willing to follow my arm along the direction to the object I'm drawing your attention to. There's nothing comparable to that, even in chimpanzees.
Right, and babies follow your gaze.
Babies follow the gaze.
Yeah, but they don't need the pointing.
They follow the gaze, but that's not the same as having an idea of what the gaze is landing on.
Right.
Of course, ultimately they do. By 6 months or so, then they really do have an idea of what mummy's looking at. But following mummy's eyes is quite a different thing from having an idea of following what mummy's looking at. But I mean, Eric, I don't know if you have views on this.
Well, I think that, obviously the origin of the human is a more complex thing than not human. There has to be several stages. But I think that the most economical way of looking at it is still, if you're really human, you have language, you have a way of remembering events. Now, it may be useful to divide up the progress of the hand in particular, but I would think, though, it's hard to imagine that humans were making tools in the way that Marina was just saying, without language, that if you're going to have a grammar that starts it, the simplest grammar, after all, is that. You have that one sign that points to the object that is numinous and so on, and that's much less complex than designing a tool. And so one would think, and also that's a collective phenomenon, because one of the ideas that I tried to express in The Origin of Language is that once you have language, then you have this néant, this space, and then individual members of the group can go back and sort of do things thinking about the fact that they are members of the group because the sign brings them together. And so you have the originary idea of the laboratory. And it's in that laboratory that somebody would invent a tool knowing that he could bring it to the group. It wouldn't be like a chimpanzee who can try to put a stick in a termite nest, but who wouldn't go to the next chimp and say, hey, you know, you can do this, and then the other one would say, yeah, but why don't you use this stick, it's bigger, and so on. They don't have language. If you had language, though, you can see that a simple chopper, and it wouldn't be the simplest type of mimesis where they just imitate you. You would teach them, and I don't believe that that was one of the, I believe one of the criteria you use for humans, that chimpanzees don't really teach their young. So you would be able to teach others how to use it. And it's that idea of the separation from the group and return to the group that the sign makes possible. So that would, it would seem to me that it would be simplest to assume that this primal pointing would come before the use of tools, and that, or at the very least, it would accelerate any kind of individual tool use that preceded.
I think I wrote a book called Studies in Pointage, and then I learnt it because what I tried to do was to imagine a language created out of pointing, and even trying to invent notions of a grammar of pointing and so on. Hewlings Jackson once said that language is not a word heap, and with pointing you only have pointing heaps. You only have, there isn't a grammar in terms of stringing pointings along. There isn't pointings that have different functions, although there is declarative and imperative pointing. And when you're pointing to someone, to something, when I'm pointing to that, the relationship between my finger and the object pointed is not quite the same as between a word and a referent, where reference is mediated through general meaning, whereas when I'm pointing to that object, that is a particular object.
But if it took place in a collective situation, where the gesture wasn't a simple pointing, but a kind of imitation of the object. In other words, where you made some kind of sign that would allow the others to realize that you weren't appropriating it, and that this became, by itself, a kind of a sign. And however, you know, whatever specifics it would have, and it might have been accompanied by some kind of cry and so on. But the idea that there would be some material signifier that would be remembered by the group, and that would evoke the group and that situation, it seems to me that's the minimal definition of language, after all. And but I would think that there would be some sort of pointing, so we might have had types of pointing before that, but this would be the collective moment when this pointing would become language, and therefore would allow the group to coalesce as a human group and avoid the alpha-beta type of pecking order, and develop a sense of its own community with all kinds of backsliding and so on. But,
you know, I come to the conclusion we can divide the history of humanity. We can have Homo Tallisius and then Homo Gansius. We just re-periodized the history of human evolution. And
that's not bad.
We can divide
So the movie's been over almost 2 hours and
well, we've just redesigned the whole history of humanity into
Thank you all so
You were
much
here
for
when it
coming,
happened.
and